Hello. So, in today's sharing, I want to talk about an experience that has been very significant in my own interior journey for the last 8 years. And it was something that was pretty hard to go through. And what that is spiritual midlife crisis, right? I didn't even know there was such a thing when I first entered into this experience. And it was such a difficult time and such a crucial dimension of my interior journey that I wanted to share a bit more about this because I know that there are more people out there who could be in this time in their journey and they may not have the term for it. They may not even realize that they are in some kind of spiritual midlife crisis. And if that is you, and you're watching this or listening to this, and this brings some light to you, I would be so glad. That's why I'm going to be doing today's sharing. So the last sharing that I did was on the critical journey, right? About the stages of faith in the critical journey. And I talked about this book. It is a resource that I only came across sometime this year, just a few months ago, right? And it came at a time when I think I'm finally coming out of this spiritual midlife crisis, and it just connected all the dots for me, right? So the critical journey, if you haven't heard about it or watched the video that I did on it yet, I would recommend that maybe you start there before coming back to today's sharing, this particular sharing on the midlife spiritual midlife crisis, all right? So today's sharing is going to cover kind of like three main areas, all right? I will share a bit about the experience of entering spiritual midlife. As always, I'm not talking about this in any authoritative manner. I'm going to be sharing from my experience, but from what I have learned, there are a lot of universal similarities in this midlife experience. Okay, so that's why there are resources that are very helpful, even though for each of us going into it, it will be a very particular and unique experience. I'm going to talk a little bit also about why, in particular, spiritual midlife is such a difficult time, and also what resources helped me navigate through this period of my life. Okay, so first, before I go on into my experience, I just want to share that the spiritual journey, I think it's filled with different crises and many crises. That's a fact. And at different points of our developmental journey, it's different kind of crises that we experience. But crises play a very important role in the spiritual journey, okay, as well as the interior integration journey. I differentiate these two terms because I want to say that for a long time, I was already on the spiritual journey, but I was not yet in the interior integration journey. Okay, so it's possible to already be on a spiritual journey without integration. It's still a very valid journey. It's a very valid experience of coming to know God and having a faith and deepening our interior life, right? So even in the spiritual journey, crises play a very important part. The midlife crisis in the spiritual journey is just one of the many crises that we'll go through. And often these crises, plural, they are like the doorways that God opens up for us. And if we go through them, if we enter those crises and enter with surrender, we can actually reach, in a sense, like another step, another stage in our relationship with God, another stage in our spiritual development. It is also very common, and I say this without judgment because it has happened to me so many times as well, where when a crisis happens, which means that God maybe opens the door, we don't go through it because there's a way. One way to respond to a crisis is to hunker down where we are or to go backwards even in the journey to what feels more secure and what feels more safe to us. And that is why I think God keeps opening doors for us in our life, which is why every now and then some kind of other crisis will pop up in our life. And I really see these crises as thresholds, okay, opportunities for us to enter. And if we enter, we move on that spiritual journey, or we move on this interior journey. So that's crisis in general. They're an essential part of spiritual development and maturing. But what I'll be sharing about today, about the spiritual midlife crisis, is a particular crisis within all these, among all these crises in the spiritual journey, right? So I'm going to share a little story with you. Okay. This is from my personal experience, how I even knew there was such a thing called spiritual midlife crisis or spiritual midlife, and what led me to it. Okay, so this was about 8 years ago, and in terms of my life journey, this was a couple of years, slightly under 2 years after I had left my full-time job in the parish. And that year since I left the parish, after I left the parish, was really a year of entering into deep solitude and silence and beginning to heal physically, first of all, because I was burned out and having all kinds of chronic health issues, and I knew I needed to tend to that. But there was also some emotional healing, but at the time, not very focused emotional healing. It was just by being by myself and with God, entering to silence, entering, a better rhythm of movement and exercise again. Because whenever I'm very caught up with work, usually exercise, unfortunately, is the first thing that goes. The regularity of that is the first thing that goes. And, just taking care of my body. So for 1 year, I was beginning to enter into a space that felt very different. So as I entered into that healing space, I felt I was drawing closer to God in a way. What I also began to experience was that there was something new, and that is that I wanted to connect with God in ways that I never did before. I wanted to connect with God outside of the sacraments, outside of the church, outside of, official prayer times that are happening before the Blessed Sacrament, for example, in the Adoration Chapel. In fact, I felt a yearning to discover Him in what, normally we would think as secular or non-sacred, non-religious dimensions of my life. I began to have more frequent conversations with God everywhere and, in all things. And then in 2016, and I shared about this in my other earlier podcast episodes as well, I had a retreat. This was around my 37th birthday. I had a retreat where God gave me an image of a huge kind of like cathedral that was under construction, and scaffolding was all around it. And the walls have already come up, but there was no ceiling yet. And what I was given to understand when I saw this image was that, this work cannot be completed. Right? I felt God was telling me this work cannot be completed. This building cannot be completed because there's something fundamentally wrong in the foundations. Okay, and so if you want to complete this project, if you wish for this building, this church to be built to completion, we're going to have to take everything down. So everything that I see in this image, all the walls that have already been built up and quite a lot of work has been done, all that has to be dismantled and taken down. And not only that, we're going to have to go into the foundations, and that means what is underground, which I can't even see. And I felt God say, we're going to have to excavate the foundation, because that's where the issues are. That's where the rot is. There's something fundamentally wrong in the foundation. We're going to have to excavate and clear the foundation and begin again. We're going to start again. And this time we'll do it right. We'll lay the foundation stone by stone, everything right. That's the only way that this church can be completed. And I knew that He was talking about me. I knew that that church was me, and He's talking about my relationship with Him, and that this church, in a sense, symbolized my relationship with Him, and the completion of this church symbolized, in a sense, my fullest union with Him, and me being fully me, right? And I had worked so hard up to that point spiritually to learn about my faith, to develop spiritual disciplines, to be so faithful, from what I understood to be faithfulness back then. And here I was hearing that it's not enough and everything has to be undone. I didn't understand at that point what that foundation actually really was referring to. Instinctively, I knew it was true, but I didn't know what God was referring to. Much later, or where I am now, I know that the foundations that He says was rotten were my human foundations, my affective foundations. He's referring to how my capacity to relate and to love has been wounded fundamentally. And that, because of that, even my spiritual growth is compromised. And he's saying that we have to go back down and heal and rebuild my human capacity to love. So after that retreat, something very strange happened. That retreat was wonderful. I felt God was very communicative. It was filled with consolation. But after that retreat, I went through like a spiritual desert. It felt like all my spiritual disciplines just fell aside and all the old compulsions and addictions surged up in my life. And what was different this time, though, was I felt I was going to let it happen. I wasn't going to fight my compulsions and addictions in the old way I used to, which was basically to suppress them or to spiritual bypass them. I never knew in the past how to ask my body or to ask myself, where's that urge coming from? Where's that compulsion coming from? I was so afraid of sinning and so determined to fight sin in that old way of understanding that I just thought, you don't even entertain the thought. So I just put it aside. Or if it's, let's say, binge watching videos or whatnot, I just wouldn't do it, or I'll do it and feel really guilty and then maybe go for confession about how I've been wasting my time, etc. And then come back and forcibly force myself to be disciplined, right? And I had been able to get by for a long time. But now all this was different. And I found myself, even as I was yielding to my compulsions, in that sense, I was talking to God. I was talking to God. I said, you know what? I said, I'm just going to do this right now. And I know it's not the best use of my time, whatnot, but I want to do this. And I don't know why I want to do this. I don't know why I'm different now, but I'm doing this. And what I began to notice was that God was with me. And after the experience, I would talk to God as well. And over time, I found this is very different because in the past, when I yielded to, let's say, what I think is temptation, even if it is just, for example, like, binge watching movies or videos or doom scrolling on my phone or whatever it was. When I realized and I know that I've been very compulsive, there was always shame and there was always a sense that this is putting me further away from God and I needed to go for a confession before I can be reinstated into like a closer relationship with God. That was what I understood catechically about the faith. But at this point in the journey, I was finding that God was with me, even when I was so-called, quote unquote, behaving badly. He wasn't further away. In fact, I could talk to him about what I was experiencing. I could unpack with him afterwards why I felt that way. And the thing is, the incredible difference for me that I experienced was that I began to experience God's love more unconditionally. I felt like I didn't have to behave better or get myself right by going through this, to confession before I can present myself with God. I entered into a new phase of closeness with God. And during this time, I began to realize that all the spiritual disciplines that I had in the past showed up, and that at the time I really thought at one point I was impressed with myself because there was a stretch of time, like I think for more than a year, maybe even 2, I had an hour of holy hour adoration before the Blessed Sacrament practically every day, right? That was quite a streak. And I thought, in a sense that was some kind of spiritual peak that I was in. I was so disciplined and it wasn't difficult during that time for me to do that. But now in this phase where my spiritual disciplines were kind of like falling apart, I felt safe enough with God, secure enough with God to realize, and I'm sure it is God's grace that revealed this to me, that all those spiritual disciplines that I was doing so well in the past, like 90% or more than 90% of it was not coming from love of Him, was not because I loved Him, but it was because I was driven to excel spiritually. It's because I was trying to impress Him, because I wanted to impress Him so that He would love me. And that was such an incredible and scary realization, especially for someone like me, for whom doing well or having God or whoever is the other person think that I'm doing well was such an important part of me feeling emotionally safe. So I knew that when I could even realize this truth, that all the wonderful spiritual growth that I had in the past, which I would say is still spiritual growth, right? It still came with grace, but yet so much of it was driven by my insecurity and it wasn't love yet. So God was showing me, oh, Anne, actually, now that you're ready to know this, I want to tell you, you're so much more beginner than you thought you were. Because there I was thinking that, I was a leader in church. I was a full-time, I was in full-time ministry. I was giving talks. I was giving retreats. I was having all these amazing spiritual disciplines that I was able to do. I thought I was pretty spiritually mature, right? Now I cringe a little when I say this now but I say with I cringe with compassion as well, because that really was where I was. And I couldn't have known otherwise until I'd gone further. And so at this point, when I had gone further and I realized that actually I was so young spiritually still, that, humanly, there were so many things in me, so much fear and insecurity, and I didn't even know how to get over that. That was when, things really changed and I entered about half a year of just all these experiences, which I just couldn't put a handle on. I didn't understand. And eventually, about 6 months after this began, so it was about 6 months after the retreat that I had and had all these experiences that I didn't know how to make sense of, I happened to have a conversation with a very seasoned spiritual director who was also a supervisor of spiritual directors. So it was a religious sister. She wasn't actually my spiritual director, although I knew her. My spiritual director had suggested that I speak to this sister in another matter because he felt that a supervisor of spiritual directors would be able to kind of give me, counsel me on how to accompany someone that I needed to accompany. And I thought I was getting out of my depth, and I just wanted to check, if what I was saying was okay. So context there is this particular person that was accompanying was during that time living in a place where he couldn't even access church. There was no local spiritual director or spiritual community. So I was just connecting with this person virtually, to have, so that he can have some kind of support. So anyway, that brought me to speak to the supervisor of spiritual directors. And after we resolved that matter, which was actually very fast, she asked me, Anne, how have you been? How are you doing? And I just told her, I said, well, sister, I said, this year has been so weird. And I told her just briefly the experiences of the last 6 months. I think I mentioned to her about the retreat and that image, and how since then, just everything seems to be falling apart. And at the same time, I said, but at the same time, I feel more secure with God than I did before. And then at the same time, I said, all the things that used to work for me, to spur me and motivate me to become, I don't know, more spiritually disciplined, they all don't work anymore. And I just told her, I don't know what the heck is going on. And she looked at me, and I remember she said, and it sounds like you're entering spiritual midlife, or you're going into spiritual midlife. So that's the first time I've ever heard such a term, okay? Spiritual midlife. And I thought, so first I remember telling her, I said, midlife already? I said, I was only 37 at the time. I remember saying, I'm only 37. I'm not even 40. What midlife, right? And another thing I was thinking, I don't know, it's I don't think so. It was just a part of me that said, that sounds so serious, or some kind of crisis. And I didn't think so. So she, being, a seasoned spiritual director as well, a good spiritual director never insists or pushes. She just says, I can give you a couple of books, or I can recommend a couple of books that you could read about this topic. And maybe you read them and see whether it connects, and maybe you'll know whether you are in spiritual midlife, right? So the two books that she suggested that I read, one was Sue Monk Kidd's When the Heart Waits, and the other book was Richard Rohr's Falling Upward, a spirituality on the two halves of the spiritual life. Okay, so I'd never heard of Sue Monk Kidd before. No, I heard of the name, but in a different context, but not of this book. And Richard Rohr, I was familiar with the name, and in fact, I would say up to that point, I had been quite conscientiously avoiding his work and maybe even being very careful when I do come across his work, because I know from, Googling and from what people are saying online that, there are a lot of voices that were saying that he's potentially dangerous and what he's teaching is not necessarily orthodox. So in the earlier part of my spiritual journey, where all that was like the most important thing, I kind of avoided his work, even though I have to confess that certain times when I read something or heard people quote some of his things, it did strike me as wise, but I just wasn't ready to go there yet. So here I was now with a trusted person, somebody that I respected and trust, and whom I knew was an effective, sound, and good spiritual director, who was directing me to read one of his books. So I thought, okay, but I will read Sumak Kids When the Heart Waits first. Okay, When the Heart Waits, Spiritual Direction for Life's Secret Questions. That's the full title. I'll read her work first. So I read that book. And I remembered thinking, oh my gosh, she's describing what I've been going through, what I've been experiencing. And I felt so seen. And I thought, oh my gosh, is this what entering spiritual midlife is about? So maybe I am in spiritual midlife, right? And then after I finished that book, I waited a couple of months to let it digest before I began reading Richard Rohr's Falling Upward. And again, I have to say, when I was reading that book, again, I recognized my own journey. In fact, I recognized that I was at the point where I was beginning to make the transition from the first half of life. I wasn't really in the second half of life yet in Richard Rohr's terms, okay? What he was describing about the second half of life was not describing me yet. What he was describing about the first half of life was definitely me in my entire life and the spiritual journey up to that point. But I was leaving that. I knew I was leaving that first half of life, but I haven't really entered the second half of life. So I knew that, okay, I was entering spiritual midlife, and that was 8 years ago. And midlife wasn't a quick thing. I mean, the whole midlife experience also has different points of transitions, right? So this is how I knew, and I just wanted to share a bit about how I knew I was entering it. We wouldn't have enough time for me to go into all about the whole midlife experience. And in fact, in most of my sharings, my podcast episodes, I've already been giving you guys snippets of what was coming during my midlife experience, my spiritual midlife experience. But I wanted to describe how I knew I was in it, because maybe that will help some of you connect and recognize that perhaps you might be entering spiritual midlife as well. So if you recall, in my last episode, okay, when I talked about the critical journey, there was this image. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, you can't see the image, but if you go over to the YouTube video of this, you would be able to see it. It's a diagram from the book, The Critical Journey, and it shows the 6 stages, right, of faith development. And the stage 1, recognition of God. Stage 2, life of discipleship, or the beginning of the life of discipleship. Stage 3 is the productive life, where you're very productive for God. And then stage 4 is called the journey inward. And it is at this point, the journey inward, that we begin to enter into the midlife experience. So what I just described to you about my experience, now I recognize, looking back, and now having read this book, The Critical Journey, that was me entering into stage 4, really stepping more and more into stage 4. Now, why it is that I, in particular, love this resource, The Critical Journey, this book, is because of the space the authors gave into describing the wall. So if you're watching this, I've highlighted that word there, the wall. So in between stage 4, which is journey inward, and stage 5, which is the journey outward, exiting, I guess you could say, exiting midlife crisis. In between, there is this experience called the wall. It's actually part of the stage 4 experience, okay? And it is so significant to the authors of The Critical Journey that they gave an entire chapter to just describe this wall experience. Now, the wall would be where I would say, I think, the crisis part of midlife really hits, okay? So entering midlife, you may not really be in crisis yet. The intensity of the midlife experience, the purging of the spiritual midlife experience really happens at the wall. And what I really love about this resource is because the authors say that at the wall is where integration must happen. If integration doesn't begin to happen, we won't move past the wall. Okay, there's no way of moving past the wall into going to stage 5 or stage 6 if we don't integrate. And by integration, they are referring specifically to the psychological and emotional dimensions of our journey, of our lives, and the spiritual. And to be honest, this is the first book I've read that specifically emphasized that this is where integration has to happen. So up to the wall, it is possible to progress in the spiritual journey, but not make much progress in the emotional or psychological healing journey. Or for some people, maybe they may actually have moved further in emotional and psychological healing, but their relationship with God hasn't really progressed as much. Well, it is at stage 4 when whichever dimension of us was kind of like lagging behind will have to catch up. So that's actually the work of the spiritual midlife, the way I see it. And the spiritual midlife crisis is actually a time of integration and healing. And it is really, really hard to go through, but it is really essential to go through for us to emerge with that kind of integration that brings both spiritual and emotional human maturity together, right? So in another book that may be better known, it may be better known, especially I think people who study spiritual direction, or even in seminaries, I think sometimes people have to read or study this James Fowler's Stages of Faith. So he also talks about, I think, 6 stages as well. Stage 6 being the stage of universalizing faith, okay, which is similar to the stage 6 in the critical journey. But James Fowler describes stage 5. So for him, he says, stage 5 conjunctive faith, he calls it conjunctive faith, is when the person acknowledges paradox and transcendence that relating reality behind the symbols of inherited systems. Okay, I'll say that again. Conjunctive faith acknowledges paradox and transcendence relating to reality behind the symbols of inherited systems. Okay. He puts in bracket here, I mean, in James Fowler's version of the stages, he didn't have a specific element that is equivalent to the wall. So stage 4 is when the person begins to individuate and reflect on their faith. And stage 4 in James Fowler's model is often when people also begin to maybe deconstruct or question and doubt. And then when they do the work of stage 4 and they reach stage 5, this is when they can acknowledge paradox and transcendence and relate to reality behind the specific concrete symbols of whatever faith tradition they are in, right? So this is in a sense, it doesn't cover the most painful part of the transition, which is why I like the critical journey so much, because when you want to understand what you're going through, when you can see something on the page that actually describes what you're experiencing and offer also some kind of understanding and explanation as to why you're going through that, that's just so powerful, right? So that's why I really recommend the critical journey, okay? For those of us who wish to know more about the midlife journey, I would say it's really, really about, go and refer to the critical journey. Okay. So spiritual midlife is particularly disorienting. Okay, so that's one of the challenges I mentioned that's different from all the other crises. It's disorienting because spiritual midlife comes after a peak that you've reached. Okay, so with the critical journey, remember stages 1 to 3, it's like you're ascending, you're getting more sure of your faith, you're getting more knowledgeable of your faith, you're becoming maybe more active and taking on leadership positions in your faith community. You're ascending, and then suddenly there's this destabilization. Like the next developmental phase is being destabilized, being taken apart, being undone. What you were sure before, now you are not so sure anymore. And it's not a matter of intellectual certainty. It's coming from someplace much deeper, because God is calling forth, He's opening your eyes to the lack of integrity within your own being, right? Like He showed me, for example, that all the spiritual things that I've done and the spiritual disciplines that I've managed to accomplish, so-called, was 90-something% driven by my need to impress him, my need to earn his approval, and not because I love him. So that realization was showing me a lack of, in that sense, not in a bad way, a lack of integration, so a lack of integrity, right? Because there I was believing that I was so spiritually mature, that I must be progressing in my spiritual disciplines because I love God. And God is showing me, no, actually, you progressed this much so far because you were very driven by your insecurities. And that is why I couldn't go further in my relationship with God. Why He said everything had to be taken down and the foundations had to be rebuilt, right? So spiritual midlife is very painful because we have to acknowledge that all the accomplishments or achievements in our spiritual life up to that point, in a sense, is dust, right? Not that they didn't matter, but suddenly at this point, it really feels like it really doesn't matter, and that the really important stuff we haven't even begun yet. But that's the gift of spiritual midlife, all right? It's disorienting, and it is different from earlier developmental crises because before we enter spiritual midlife, usually what helps us overcome the crises is more understanding, more knowledge, more clarity, more certainty about what is it that we need to do and doing it, and being, embedded in a faith community and having people hold us mutually accountable. All that stuff that worked from stages 1 to 3, suddenly at stage 4, I'm talking about the critical journey kind of stages, at spiritual midlife, they don't work because the work of spiritual midlife is not growing in knowledge, it's not growing in certainty, it's not using our will to force ourselves to perform our faith. Spiritual midlife is a time of stripping, of being stripped. You can't even do the work yourself. That's part of what makes midlife so uncomfortable, because those of us who are so used to using our strength and our ego, like our will and our strength, to accomplish even spiritual growth in the earlier stages, suddenly now at this point, we find that there's nothing we can do. At midlife, in the spiritual life, the only thing we can do is to let God do it to us. So we have to let God do it to us, let it be done unto me. And what God does is often an undoing. And we find ourselves needing to be emptied, stripped, becoming raw and naked before God, seeing ourselves more truly for the first time, and experiencing the unconditional love of God as we see all the things we have not dared to look at about ourselves. Okay, so this spiritual midlife experience is particularly difficult to find support in when we're going through it. And that's also part of what makes being in spiritual midlife such a challenging season. All right, and it's difficult to find support because on one hand, I would just say a lot or much fewer people would have actually went through this stage. And many people who are very active in the usual places that we were active in the earlier stages, in the first half of life, in our institutions, for example, even our spiritual leaders, our faith leaders, most of them are familiar with the earlier stages and are not familiar with spiritual midlife. Okay, so that's why it can be difficult to find support. But if you want to learn more about this and the kind of support that actually would help you in midlife, in spiritual midlife, again, I refer you to The Critical Journey, as well as the other books that I mentioned earlier. Okay, they can be helpful. Just don't worry. Don't be overwhelmed. It's going to take as long as it takes. God's grace is sufficient. Okay, and I can say this to you because I've experienced it. So in terms of resources that will be helpful during spiritual midlife, spiritual direction for sure would have really been helpful in the earlier stages, especially when we are in stage 2 and 3, becoming more serious about our faith and practicing our faith and leading in our faith communities. But especially when we enter into spiritual midlife, we need sound. And by sound here is a different thing from just saying orthodox, because I know for some people sound just means very orthodox too, let's say Catholic teaching. There is more to the spiritual journey than orthodoxy, okay, and orthopraxy. So that's part of the challenge of finding support, because for many people, sound stops at being orthodox. There needs to be, that's why you need often someone who's familiar with spiritual midlife, maybe have experienced it themselves or have the willingness at least to not direct you, because in spiritual midlife, what we need is not top-down kind of direction, but someone who can help us enter into a more spacious time, who respects that it is really the Holy Spirit's work at this time. It feels very ambiguous, but we can only wait, right? And to help us to discern and wait. So spiritual direction plays a huge part about being in spiritual midlife. But you need to find the right kind of spiritual director, the right fit, the spiritual director. Psychotherapy actually becomes very, very important if you haven't yet gone for psychotherapy up and before spiritual midlife. This is when, remember I mentioned that according to the authors of The Critical Journey, the wall experience within stage 4 is when the psychological and emotional dimension of our journey has to be integrated with the spiritual dimension. So for me, that was the case. The human foundations that needed rebuilding, excavating and rebuilding, had to take the form of this kind of help. And that was what I went through. I started counseling, and then eventually also into deeper psychotherapy with working on family of origin wounds, especially because those wounds, our family of origin wounds, are usually what destroys or really destroys our human foundation that enables us to love and be loved. Okay, it happens very young, so it happens usually in our family of origin, whatever our childhood experiences were. And going through psychotherapy, going into that dimension, going into psychotherapy helped me to recognize what those wounds were and how to heal. So in particular, inner child healing, internal family systems, and somatic healing, which was a more recent part. Okay, the somatic dimension of healing of trauma, all of that helped with the integration that I needed to go through as I went through the wall, which is my spiritual midlife crisis, right? And there are also books that have been helpful, including the ones that I have shared so far. There are others as well, but I don't feel prompted at this time to just kind of lay out all the books, because especially when we're talking about spiritual midlife, actually anything about interior journey, we must respect in that sense where a person is and the resource that can meet the person where they are. And just because a book is really helpful, to me at some point, doesn't mean that it's necessarily good for me to just recommend it generally. So the three that I mentioned earlier, The Critical Journey, When the Heart Waits, and even Richard Rohr's Falling Upward, I feel that those three are really a good place to start. They're general enough that you will probably be able to find something that connects with you. And at least for you to confirm if you are going through spiritual midlife. Okay. I also want to add that especially when we're going through spiritual midlife is when having trauma-informed support and, in that sense, emotionally safe holding is particularly important, precisely because we are excavating and uncovering all these deep wounds, especially these deep human wounds, and especially for those of us whose wounds also come from some dimension of spiritual abuse. It could be covert. It could be very subtle, okay? But not where there's not just emotional or physical or sexual abuse, but especially if there's some dimension of spiritual harm that we've experienced without knowing it, those experiences would have tainted our experience of faith. In spiritual midlife, all this begins to surface and healing needs to happen. And that's why we need trauma-informed spaces. And unfortunately, a lot of the usual spiritual formation spaces are not yet trauma-informed. They're just not aware of that yet. But I just want to say that even if someone is not formally trained to be trauma-informed, my experience is that those who are really humble and attuned and who maybe themselves has gone through spiritual midlife, they naturally would be more attuned, and supernaturally, I guess, as a really good spiritual director, for example, will be attuned to the Holy Spirit and will listen to the promptings of how the Holy Spirit is asking him or her to respond to you. Okay, so it doesn't have to be somebody who intellectually understands what being trauma-informed is. if you find the right person, they will be safe for you. You will feel seen, you will feel held, you will experience that unconditional acceptance and love that you cannot offer yourself when you're going through this. And that's what you need to be looking for, okay? Yeah, because this is the time when psychological and spiritual dimensions are being integrated. Last point before I wrap today's sharing up is that a lot of people who have entered spiritual midlife are filled with anxiety and doubt because everything that they thought was so clear before, they not that clear anymore. They feel drawn in a direction that can even seem and feel very wrong based on their first half of life understanding of what faith should be. So the fear of leaving certainty and clear black and white beliefs behind is a very normal part of spiritual midlife crisis. Okay, the midlife experience in general, even before you enter the crisis part of midlife, but especially when you enter the crisis part of midlife, it's really an excavation of the foundations of our human foundations. Okay, so this fear, this anxiety of leaving behind what was so clearly stated for us in the past, what is right, what is wrong, that's normal. And so if you feel that you're experiencing that, don't be afraid. You are normal, okay? It's a normal part of the transformation process. So if you think that you might be in spiritual midlife or spiritual midlife crisis, I would encourage you to get support and find out. And it can just begin by, for example, reading the book When Your Heart Waits, which is the book I read, which is a very gentle and beautiful book because it was So Monk Kid describing her experience of entering that time of her life. She writes beautifully. I mean, she's an incredible author as well. So that's a very gentle way of maybe finding out if you're also entering spiritual midlife and feeling accompanied by the writer who was describing her experiences of entering spiritual midlife. Right. So that's it for today's sharing. I hope that you found it helpful. And, and if that's what you're going through right now, just know that I'm praying for you, that the right support will come to you, or that you'll find the right support. And just remember, God's grace truly is sufficient. It's not easy, but it will be sufficient. And don't give up, and don't feel bad if you feel like you can't keep going. All that is normal. And there's just so much compassion that God has for us. And remember, people who haven't gone through this part of their journey will not understand it. Okay, so just be discerning who you share with, because really those who have not gone through it will not be able to understand it and may even give you harmful advice that will distress you further. Okay, so take care until the next time. Bye.